Welcome in, everyone. Ready to dive into a court case that's got people talking.
Absolutely. This one's a real head-scratcher. UK courts, public nuisance laws, and Formula One.
Yeah, you heard that right. This case has it all. We're looking at the very first convictions under the UK's updated public nuisance law, and it all went down at the British Grand Prix.
It's a precedent-setting case, no doubt. It
Yeah.
really digs into how far those laws can go, especially with protests becoming bolder these days.
So before we hit the gas on this one,
Hmm.
could you give us a quick breakdown of public nuisance laws, just so everyone's on the same page?
For sure. Public nuisance, it's all about finding that balance, individual freedoms versus what's good for the whole community.
Right, like finding that sweet spot where everyone's rights are respected.
Exactly. And the UK just revamped these laws back in June 2022. So this case is a major test drive, how these new rules actually work in the real world.
And the case that's got everyone's attention involves a protest at the 2022 British Grand Prix, right? Something to do with Just Stop Oil.
That's the one. 6 people linked to Just Stop Oil were charged over their actions at Silverstone that day.
Silverstone. Okay, so we're talking fast cars, high adrenaline, the whole shebang. What exactly did these protesters do? Give us the play-by-play.
This wasn't just like a few signs in the stands. Think way more intense. Picture this. The race is already chaotic. Huge crash, red flags waving, cars slowing down. And that's when the protesters make their move. They scale fences, run straight onto the track.
Hold on, they actually ran onto the track while the race was still going on.
Yeah, it was wild. They specifically targeted a section called Wellington Strait, right as the remaining cars were trying to navigate this already dangerous situation. And then they just sat down on the track itself.
Wellington Strait, for those of us who aren't gearheads, what's so special about that part of the track?
Oh man, Wellington Strait is iconic. It's known for insane speeds, a place where drivers push their cars to the absolute limit. To have people just pop up there, I mean, even just picturing it gives me chills.
I bet. Talk about a recipe for disaster. You've got these high-performance cars, incredibly skilled drivers, experienced marshals. Everyone there accepts a certain level of risk, but this is a whole other level.
And that's where it gets legally messy. The charge was under Section 78 of the 2022 Police, Crime, Sentencing, and Courts Act, basically the bit about intentionally causing a public nuisance. But here's the kicker. The law mentions a section of the public, but it doesn't define what that actually means.
Whoa. So how did the judges in this case even begin to unpack that? Sounds like they were handed a legal jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing.
Pretty much. They had to look back at older cases for clues, which is tricky because those were decided under the old public nuisance laws. It's like trying to assemble a brand new phone using instructions from like a 1990s brick phone.
Yeah, it's like using the wrong instruction manual. Good luck with that. They got some hints, but every case has its own quirks, right?
Right, like what's a section of the public at a park protest is different from a Formula One race. Exactly. High-speed cars versus, say, a picnic, totally different context. And this case really throws that into sharp relief.
This case is like the ultimate test case then. So how did each side even argue their case with this whole section of the public thing being so vague?
So the prosecution kept it simple. They said, look, these protesters running onto the track, they put people in danger. The drivers, those marshals responsible for safety, even themselves.
Okay, so endangering those specific people, that was enough to be considered a section of the public, according to them.
Yep. They argued that cluster of folks thrown into that risky situation, boom, section of the public. Case closed as far as they are concerned.
Bold strategy. So how did the defense counter that argument?
They got clever. They said, hold on, by the time those protesters actually sat down, the biggest risk was gone. Most cars had already zoomed past.
So basically they were saying the timing of it all, that mattered. Less about the act itself, more about when they did it.
Precisely. They were all about that timing argument. And get this, they challenged the whole focusing on individuals thing.
As opposed to a broader.
Exactly. They said picking out like this driver or that marshal doesn't equal endangering a section of the public. Public implies a bigger chunk of society, right?
Right. It's a bit more general
Right.
than just a few named individuals.
And they even brought up this really interesting question. Can someone cause a public nuisance against themselves? It gets to the heart of what the public even means in law.
It's a good question. Makes you think. Okay, so we have a high-stakes incident, a brand new law, both sides making good points. What did the judges decide?
Here's where it gets really interesting. The judges went with the prosecution guilty. And to make things even wilder, the appeals court agreed.
Wow, a double whammy. They weren't messing around. What was the judge's reasoning for such a strong decision?
They focused on a few things. First, they said the risk assessment, it starts at the very beginning of the action, not just when they sat on the track, but from that first step onto the grass.
So even though the cars were already slowing down at that point, the judges said it was that initial run across the grass when cars were still coming in hot that was the problem.
Exactly. It's the whole chain of events that matters, not just the final pose.
I see what you mean. So they were basically saying the moment they crossed that line, they were already in the lethal danger zone.
Yep. And that's why this case is such a big deal. It's setting a precedent. Like, imagine a protest that shuts down a highway at rush hour.
Even if it's peaceful, just the act of disrupting things like that.
Could land people in hot water, yeah. This case has really thrown a wrench into things.
It's a real dilemma. How do we keep people safe, but also protect free speech? No easy answers there. It feels like this is going to make people hesitant to protest, even for good causes.
Yeah, that's the big question, right? The judges were clear that risk assessment starts right at the beginning.
So even if your protest is, like, perfectly legal, you've got permits, everything.
There's always that chance something goes sideways.
Exactly. Counter-protesters, police response, whatever. Knowing that risk kicks in from the moment you gather. How does that change things?
Do you play it super safe? Maybe a less disruptive protest, even if it means your message isn't as strong?
Right, because then you're getting into, like, is that really free speech if you're holding back that much?
Tough call, isn't it? Gets to the heart of how democracies work, balancing those rights.
Totally. Some will say this law stops people from speaking out, makes them too scared.
Others will say, well, now protesters have to think about consequences more, responsibility, all that.
It's not black and white, is it? Each situation's different.
Exactly. And that's where folks like our listeners come in, informed citizens, right?
Because this case shows why it matters to stay informed. Laws impact our lives, even if we're not on a racetrack.
100%. You got to understand the arguments from all sides, be able to have those conversations.
So as we wrap up this deep dive UK's public nuisance law, convictions at the Grand Prix,
It's quite a combo.
we got to ask, what happens now? How does this change protests, not just in the UK, but everywhere?
Because people are watching this case wondering how far those public safety arguments go.
It's a global conversation starting up. For our listeners, if you want the nitty-gritty legal details,
We've got the court judgment linked in the show notes.
don't be afraid to dig in. Keep asking the tough questions. Stay curious. That's what this is all about. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.